Now we need to take a look at our store schema here and talk about some custom data types. Why? Because what types do we have so far? A string, a string, a string, and an array of strings. So it's important to note that there are many types of data that can be stored in a MongoDB database. And it's really important to, before you actually start storing data, to figure out how your data should be stored. So let's say example for a date. When we want to store when a store was created. We want to store when a store was created. So let's make a created property. And the type is not going to be a string. It's not going to be a number. It's going to be a date, right? Because that is a real date. And what that will allow us to do is to do complex queries in the future where you just search for things in a specific month or between these two dates or are greater than the following date. And MongoDB has a whole bunch of custom queries for dealing with dates. And if you store it as a date, then you'll be able to take advantage of those. When I did one of my projects, I just stored it as a timestamp because I thought it was a badass, and I stored everything as a Unix timestamp. But I realized that it's much better to store it as a real date, so you can take advantage of all the custom queries with MongoDB. Now, the default of date is just going to be date.now. And what that will mean is when you create a store, it will just simply set the created property to be whatever date.now. If you've never used date.now, it's pretty sweet. It's a static method on date, and it will just tell you what the current time is in milliseconds since God created the earth. So now MongoDB has, as well as having stuff built in for numbers and times and strings, it also has a huge feature set for dealing specifically with stuff that is location based. So it will allow you to search based on the coordinates for things that are within a couple kilometers or a couple miles, or it will allow you to search for stores that are within the following bounds or within the a province or a state, wherever it is that you're living. So that's pretty cool because you can do these really complex queries and not have to do any of the math or any of the hard query lookups behind it because it's all built into MongoDB. So we're going to make a location property here, and that's going to be an object. Now, there are many ways of storing data, and the way that we're going to be doing it is storing it as a point, which is just going to be like a pin on a map, because you could also store like a custom location, maybe if you were outlining a state or maybe outlining a block or a couple streets, that would be multiple points. But in our case, we just have a latitude and longitude, and that's where we're going to drop the pin on the map. So we'll say type. And the type itself has to be a little bit weird because it is technically a string. So you say type string, but you say default is going to be a point. And this seems a little weird. It took me a while to figure this out, but you have a type property, which is a object, which has a type of string and a default of point. Now we have a couple properties, or sort of sub properties, that will live inside of location that make up a point. So we have coordinates, and the coordinates is going to be an array of long and lat. And if that sounds backwards, it's because it is. So we have it, that is going to be an array, and each item in the coordinates is going to be an object. So maybe I'll put this like this. And the coordinates are a type of number, because our coordinates look like something like 43 dot whatever, and then negative 131 dot whatever. So those two values, lat and long, those are going to be numbers. So type of numbers, and required is going to be true, or as we learned earlier, you must supply coordinates. Then we also need an address, because lat and long are not all that useful to a user. It's helpful for a map, but we also want to store the physical address of the location. So that is going to be a type of string, and the required is you must supply an address. Good. I think we've got that now. So we have a location property that has a type of string, which the default's to point, has a coordinates, which is going to be an array of numbers, and it has an address, which is going to be a string, and both of those are required. Good. Now, the next step is we need to edit our edit screen here in order to accept a lat, a long, and an address. So let's go back to our store form. Oh, before we go to store form, make sure you take the quotes off the string. Why? Because it is a type of string that's a built-in JavaScript type, not quote string. So make sure you take that off. Now we'll go over to our store form and start creating an interface for actually adding our address and our coordinates. So we'll go to our store form here and let's do a little comment. That's how you comment in Pug // dash. I want to say address lat and long, or let's do long and lat. We'll talk about that in just a second. So we need a label for address. Give ourselves an input with the type of text, the ID of address, and the name of location square bracket address. Now, if you've never seen this syntax before, what is actually happening if we open up our app.js and scroll down to app.use, see this body parser URL encode extended true. What that extended true does is it allows us to use inputs that sort of have nested data in them, meaning that this is going to come as location dot address because we need location dot address as nested data. So by putting square bracket and then the name of the sub property, that will allow us to send nested data without having to do any extra heavy lifting, either on the client side before we send it or on the server side as we receive that data. It's pretty neat. I really like that feature of Express. So we have our name of address, and let's actually just try that for now. We have to add a new one because there's a little bit we need to do to edit them. So we'll go to add and say new store. We'll say good eats, and then we'll add an address of 123. Oh, we forgot to add a text for our label. 123 Fake Street, and add a couple. So give it a save. And say successfully created new store. Care to leave a review? Obviously, we can't see it yet, but we'll go back here. We'll go to new store and edit it. And how come address isn't filled out? Well, that's because we need to set the value of this to be store.location.address. Give that a save and refresh. Hey, now Fake Street is showing up. But I need to tell you something. When you have store.location.address, what if location doesn't exist? And you try to read a property of something that is not an object or does not exist. It's going to tell you cannot read property address of undefined because location is undefined. So that's going to be a bit of a problem for when we go to add a new one right now. See, we get this error here. Cannot read property address of undefined. Why is that? Because we don't have an address yet. So in this case, what we need to do is to take this value and to wrap it in some parentheses. And we'll say store.address and store.location, store.location and store.location.address. And what that will do is it will first check if store.location exists. And if it does, it will go and return the second thing. If store.location does not exist, it will just return false, or it won't return anything and the value will be empty. So that's a nice little way that we can do sort of a check for that property first. And you can see that it doesn't error out. But if we were to go to one of our properties here, maybe we'll go back to bakery and add an address, 455 Fake Street, save. You see that the Fake Street's there. If I refresh, the data will always be coming back. Good. Now let's do the long and the lat. So we'll go underneath that. We'll say label for LNG, longitude. And we'll say address LNG. And then we'll have an input with the type of number. Because actually it should just be type of text because we don't need the interface for input type of number will give us the arrows. And why would you ever pick an address with up and down arrows? Then the ID is going to be LNG, and the name is going to be location, square bracket, coordinates. And if we look back at our store, coordinates is an array, and the longitude needs to be the first thing. So I have always done it where it's lat and long, meaning that lat comes first and long comes second. But upon wasting several hours on building this project, I realized that there's this whole other world of people who build it with long and first and then lat. So absolutely 100% make sure um, that your long comes first and your latitude comes second in this array. That's just the way that MongoDB expects the data to be stored. And if you do it the opposite, you're either going to end up in Australia, or if you're Australian, you come to Canada or wherever the digging through the earth is. Or it will give you errors where being like, that's not a correct latitude and longitude. So triple check it's long then lat. And then we'll just duplicate this. And I'll swap out that for lat, and the second value, which is going to be 1, which because it's 0 based. Good. Oh, all right. That should be lat as well. Let's try give ourselves some values here. So 127 and -43. Give that a save. The values aren't here, but that's because we haven't actually put them back into it. So let's try a quick dump of our values again. Pre equals h.dump store. Let's see if they're actually even getting stored before we try to display them. There we go. Coordinates 127, -43. So what we need to do is go to here and say the value equals, and we'll do another one of these long store.location and store.location.coordinates. First one, and we can just take that whole thing and dupe it over for the second one. Now when we refresh, see how our long and our lat have values. If I change that to 1 and give it a save, it will be able to update those values for us, no problem. Other things we want to do here is add a required attribute onto it, just so you get some client-side validation, making sure that somebody puts it in. But you'll notice that if we actually delete address and give it a save, we get an error that says you must supply an address. Well, why is that happening? Well, our store requires an address, which if you do not give it a string with an address in it, it says you must supply an address. And what's happening here is that when we go to our store controller and we go to create store, you notice that we're not handling that error anywhere. But what is happening, because we are using async await, and because we're using that error handler, what happens is that this await store.save, that will fail because our validation does not pass. And what will happen is that, let's look at our error handlers again. Our error handlers will call next. And what does next do? Next will go into our app.js, and we'll go to our routes. Here we go. And if it does not work, it'll say, all right, next. And then it will go down the chain of events. And what actually happens is that we have this flash validation error handler, where now that we know about flashes, we can sort of help with them. We say, if there is no errors, return next error. And what that means is that, we'll maybe put a comment there. If there are no errors to show for flashes, skip it. And what that will do is it'll just pass on the error to the stack trace. But if there is actually an error message that we have, in our case, we're going to check if the error has some errors on it, then we're just going to flash them, because the model that we're using here will actually pass us an error message. And if we have a good error message from this, we don't need to show a stack trace because it didn't break. It's just a validation error. And the error handler will, for each of the possible errors, it will flash that error and show it on the page. And then it will call res.redirect back. And that will just redirect us to the page that we were on previously, and it will not have actually updated. So that's really nice. You just have to have this once in your application, and you don't have to worry about it, because the errors are sort of going to filter through the different levels that we have there. So I'm not going to save anything there. And if we were to change this to 123 Fake Street, give it a save, it does work properly, and we get our success message here. Good. Let's go back to our store from here. Let's get rid of that dump. Now let's actually hook up to Google Maps, so that when you type into here, these long and lat are actually going to populate with real values, rather than us having to work with the existing ones that we have.